Okay, so when you're building something truly massive, think a data center that's multiple stories high. You're dealing with just incredible amounts of electricity. And keeping everyone safe in that environment, it's not just about wearing a hard hat. It's about having a completely ironclad plan. So today we're going to dive into what separates a good safety plan from a truly great one. So let me just ask you this straight up. On a project where one tiny mistake can have absolutely catastrophic results, what's the real difference maker? It's not just about having a list of rules. It's about the depth and the rigor of those rules. And that right there brings us to what's basically the gold standard in the industry, a framework often called Appendix A. Now, I want you to think of this less like a document and more like the master blueprint for electrical safety when the stakes are incredibly high.
What's really interesting here is that these goals go way beyond just, don't get hurt. It's all about creating a culture. Look at the focus. Clear communication, making sure everyone, even the outside vendors, is completely on the same page. And maybe most important of all, empowering any single worker to hit the brakes if something doesn't feel right.
Now, at the very heart of this safety culture is a procedure called lockout, tagout, or LOTO for short. The idea is actually pretty simple, but it is absolutely vital. When a machine needs to be worked on, you physically lock the power source so it literally cannot be turned back on by accident. This prevents a potentially lethal surprise, and it is the absolute foundation of de-energization safety.
And hey, if locking things down is that serious, you can bet that powering them up is just as intense. A great plan doesn't just let somebody wander over and flip a switch. Nope. It requires a formal request, a review by multiple teams, a site-wide notification, and a living, breathing electrical diagram that shows you exactly what is live at any given moment. There are simply no assumptions.
Of course, none of this works unless everybody knows exactly what their job is, and the blueprint defines these roles with total precision. You've got the LOTO manager, who's kind of the orchestra conductor for the whole process. You have authorized workers who actually apply the locks, and then affected workers, the people who need to be aware of what's going on. And watching over all of it is the general contractor or construction manager. See? No gray areas, just crystal clear responsibility.
Okay, so that's the ideal. That's the blueprint. But what happens when we hold that up against a lot of the standard safety plans you see out in the real world? Well, this is where a gap analysis starts to tell a really interesting story.
Here's a perfect example. Commissioning. That's the final, super high-risk phase where you're testing everything for the first time. Appendix A demands a dedicated, totally separate safety plan just for this phase. But a super common gap is just lumping it into the general site plan, which completely glosses over the very unique dangers and specific procedures that are involved.
And this quote really gets to the heart of it. It's not that other plans are bad, it's that the blueprint demands a completely different level of detail. Think about those words: granularity, formalization, explicit responsibility. It's the difference between a rough sketch and a high-resolution photograph.
And this idea of granularity, of digging into the details, it pops up everywhere. So let's look at a few other really critical areas where standard procedures they often fall short. All right, take safety audits. A typical plan might say something like, yeah, we do audits, but the Appendix A standard says, no, you will conduct a formal audit with kickoff and closing meetings every 3 months using these specific detailed forms. It takes a vague idea and turns it into a concrete, non-negotiable process. And that 3-month cycle, it's so important. It turns safety from a document you write once and forget about into a living program, one that's always being checked, always being improved. It's all about being proactive instead of reactive.
And here's another huge one. A standard plan might have a general one-size-fits-all procedure for shutting off power, but Appendix A, it demands an equipment-specific procedure. That means a custom step-by-step guide for every single major piece of equipment, spelling out every valve, every switch, every breaker. There is zero guesswork allowed.
And honestly, the list goes on. We see these gaps pop up again and again. Things like not having detailed plans for temporary power, like that big generator you see there, or no formal process for different companies to compare safety notes before they start working, not keeping a lessons learned log, not even distinguishing between a simple lockout and a complex one. Each of these might seem small, but when you add them up, they create some serious risk.
So the big question is, how do you fix all this? How do you actually bridge that gap between a standard plan and this world-class blueprint? Well, the answer is actually surprisingly simple, and it's not about adding more paper to a binder. This quote from the analysis really says it all. The number one gap seen time and time again is just the lack of a simple, formal statement that says we commit to meeting or exceeding this higher standard. Everything starts with that documented commitment. It's that simple.
Because ultimately, a truly great safety program isn't about having a better checklist. It's about building a fundamentally different mindset. It's a culture that is obsessed with detail, that's built on formal processes, and is completely dedicated to relentless, proactive planning.
And that really leaves us with one final question to think about. Whether you're working on a huge construction site or just in an office, is your approach to safety just a document sitting on a shelf? Or is it a living, breathing culture that actually shapes every single decision you make? Because the answer to that question makes all the difference in the world.